Scenes depicted from this 1960s-era Texaco commercial are of course not accurate of American life during the Vietnam War. It seemed especially true for those serving in Vietnam, and perhaps even more true for the wives and husbands of these servicemen and women. While America's involvement in Vietnam continued, there remained a home front that continued battles at home as they awaited their loved ones' return. Much of the attention on the Vietnam War has been focused on the men and women who fought in the conflict, but in this Holland Vietnam Veterans interview, we will be interviewing Trudy Fetters, wife of Special Forces veteran Dave Fetters, on her life and experiences as an Army wife.
Okay, I was born in Grand Rapids, Michigan, 1944, into a very conservative Dutch Calvinist family. Grew up in Grand Rapids, but my family had a summer home in Holland. I was number 4 of 6. My mother was a stay-at-home mom. My father had his own business. But then in 1949, he bought this Ford Woody wagon so we could all fit in it. And what's interesting is that the car is still in the family today. And every Wednesday afternoon, stores would close. So on Wednesday afternoon, we would either go out to our cottage in Holland or day trips to the zoo in Lansing or a picnic. Then every summer, too, we always went to Chicago for a weekend, all of us, Niagara Falls, camping up at Mackinac City, 8 people and all the camping gear in one car. So we had really a great childhood. And I think that's probably where I got this sense of adventure. Let's try this, let's go here, let's do that, because my dad was always taking us someplace. I would say it kept us and brought us together real close, because I can remember driving out to Holland, we would be singing songs. It was, my brother sort of dabbled with the harmonica, and we would just, all 8 of us would all be singing songs as we drove out to Holland. So I would say we were quite a close-knit family, and we all got along well. All 6 of us went to the Christian schools. We walked down to Baxter Christian School, Grand Rapids Christian High School, and Calvin College. We were in an extremely close-knit community between the churches and the schools. And church was, of course, twice every Sunday. Catechism on Wednesday nights. We weren't allowed to play outside too much on Sundays, but for the summers we were in Holland. Things were a little more relaxed there. Still went to church twice on Sunday, but we could wear shorts, couldn't go swimming. We were right there on the lake, but couldn't even put our swimsuits on. So it was a very, very conservative.
It was at the summer cottage where Trudy met Dave Fetters, also from Holland, and then they began dating.
Well, I knew who Dave was because their house was just a few blocks from our cottage. So I always knew the family. But then one summer started, all of a sudden we were in college and we kind of thought, he's not so bad. We would always just hang out either by the boat there or at the marina. And then we got to talking and we were all comparing movies. Even though we weren't supposed to go to movies, we did. And it was West Side Story was the movie. And I remember piping up that I didn't like it. And when I would say that other times, people would always look at me like, boy, is she weird. She doesn't like West Side Story. And Dave piped up then when we were sitting all there at the marina. And he said, yeah, I didn't like it either. I thought it was not a worthwhile movie. And so right away I thought, oh, there's a connection there. Someone else, finally, my opinion is validated. So that's kind of how it just slowly evolved from just hanging out to actually dating. There was a bit of a family issue because we were Protestants and the Fetters were all Catholic. And my family was extremely opposed to my dating someone who wasn't of our circle. But somehow they realized that this was a futile battle. They weren't going to win it. So we did get married, and I still had a year to go at Calvin College. Dave had finished up at Michigan State, so we got married in '66. And then he started working as an engineer in Grand Rapids, and I was finishing up my last semester at Calvin College. Shortly after we got married, I remember him saying, I'm probably going to get something from Uncle Sam. And I didn't pay much attention. I would just repress it. I would put it to the back of my mind. No, not us. How are they going to know about us? Well, then he did get a letter. It was a draft notice, because I remember then the two of us went down to the draft board in Grand Rapids there, and he signed up, volunteered, rather than being drafted. Well, my world perspective at that time must have been pretty narrow. I really couldn't have told you what was going on in the world. I guess I knew there was something going on in Vietnam, that people were being drafted, but as far as knowing anything about the Vietnam War or knowing anyone else that had ever been drafted or was facing the same situation, I didn't know. It was all of a sudden kind of out of the clear blue. Why? It doesn't affect us. We're not in the Army. We're such tiny little cogs in in this little Grand Rapids. It really was not on my radar. How I felt, I guess just kind of numb, in shock, like this really is happening. It was partly the fear of the unknown. We had our whole life planned here. I'll graduate in June, we'll get a teaching job, you'll keep working here in Grand Rapids, and this is going to be our life. And suddenly, it was all changed. I don't feel that I felt, my patriotic duty to do this, or for Dave to do this, but I didn't feel like this was my chance or our chance to give back to our country. I didn't have any of those kind of feelings at all. It was just an acceptance, like, oh, this is what it's going to be. Okay, let's go with it. It was a Sunday afternoon, and he had to catch the Greyhound bus out of Grand Rapids to the reception station in Detroit. So my parents took us down to the Greyhound bus depot there in Grand Rapids, and he got the bus, and there's a picture, and the clock behind us says 3 o'clock, and Dave and I are both standing there real glum, and my mother's smiling. So to this day, I don't know why she's smiling, but he got on the bus and left, packed up all our belongings, which was probably 2 boxes worth, and moved back home for the 6 months until Dave came home at the end of July. But once Dave got down to Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri for basic training, then he would try to get a telephone call through to me on Sunday evenings. So I could at least count on a phone call from him on Sunday nights. Otherwise, it was just write letters back and forth. It was very awkward, very difficult for me to suddenly move from our own apartment with my husband, everything is happy, to go back home. The relationship was different. Suddenly I was a married woman, but I was living back with my parents. My parents, and even Dave's parents, never said anything about, why did you enlist? Why didn't you just wait to be drafted? I guess it was just kind of the inevitable. It was very hard. I missed my husband, but I still had to continue on at school. But by the time I graduated in June, Dave came home at the end of July for his officer training, and we knew already then that I would be going with him down to Fort Benning, Georgia. And once we got down there, he'd be in training for 6 months. And once we moved to Georgia, we only had a couple days to find me in an apartment. Sometimes we would call numbers that were in the newspaper, and the minute they found out that I was military, it was, we don't rent to military, and they would hang up. But we had all our worldly goods in the back of our '59 Chevy. And we found a house, but then after a couple of weeks, Dave was able to contact me. And he said, hey, my roommate's wife is looking for a roommate. She has a little house. So that's how it evolved. And then I moved to Phoenix City, Alabama. I finally got a job in Alabama in a little town outside of Phoenix City, Seal, in an all-black school. And I was the only white person at the entire school. So technically they could say their school was integrated, so they would get federal funds, but none of the supplies or anything went to our school. I had 53 little kids in first grade, and I only had about 35 desks. No pencils, no papers, no supplies. I had a broken window by my desk that I taped paper over.
Though Trudy was living in 2 separate worlds, one with her difficult job in teaching in Alabama, and the other back as an Army wife, she said her proudest moment during Dave's training was his graduation from Officers Candidate School, a 6-month course designed to make soldiers into leaders.
would have been his graduation from officer candidate school and his commissioning as a second lieutenant. That was a real high point. There were probably 60 married fellows and maybe 15 wives there. So then we 15 would go and watch the football game. Any opportunity that we had that we could at least see the guys, we were there. Yeah, the other wives, we would have probably a monthly tea where we were trained on the proper etiquette of being an officer's wife, when to wear hats, when we had to wear gloves, when they had to be long gloves, when we would have to wear a long dress, proper protocol for answering the phone. You knew what was expected of you. Once he received his commission, then he also had received his orders for Special Forces at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. We stayed at Fort Benning for an extra 3 weeks. Then there was a 2-week leave, and then we ended up at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. But then there was still the 3-month officers qualifying course for Special Forces. Once one passes the 3-month officers qualifying course, then they are actually an official Special Forces soldier. I think what we learned from officers candidate school and Special Forces school and our time at the Army base is there's a certain way to do something, there's a right way, and it's the only way. There's always time to do it over if it's wrong, but do it right the first time. And what I learned was to be more independent. I always thought, or I didn't think, it was just assumed when you get married, the husband will take care of this and he'll do the banking and all this stuff. Well, suddenly it's all up to me.
With Dave now a member of the Special Forces, or the elite group known as the Green Berets, Trudy reflected on her time as a wife of a member of this special group and how routine could sometimes be broken.
As a wife of a Special Forces member there, we would have probably a monthly officers' wives teas, they were called, from Company B, which was Dave's company there with the 7th Special Forces Group at Fort Bragg. So we would have our monthly teas, and somebody came up with a wild idea, let's see what our guys do. So they said, okay, maybe we can arrange it. We'll jump out of the 34-foot airborne training towers and rappel down the 45-foot rappelling tower. So that's what we did, and we either all wore our husbands' uniforms or some of the ladies just wore slacks. So we met out there at the jump tower, and we suited up with the harness, and it was 5 flights up to the top of the jump tower, and we're strapped with this harness strap attached to a big zip line. You stand in the door, and on the word go, out we went. And Dave's down there looking at me so proud. I can't disappoint him. I have to do this. So I did. Out where I went. And some of the ladies got all the way to the top, stood in the door, chickened out. So what we don't do to save our marriage. What was interesting is we had a little lunch between the jump tower and the rappelling tower, but we ladies had to provide the lunch. So we made the sandwiches and brought the drinks and everything. So in a way it was typical, women, here's what you do. You make the food. Men, here's what you do. You do the fun stuff. But then between the jump tower and out to the rappelling tower, there was an ambulance truck. So I thought, well, rather than just ride out there to the rappelling tower with Dave, I'll see if I can get a ride in the ambulance. Mm-hmm. So that was fun because people would see the driver, and then I was in the passenger side with the window down with the uniform on, showing that I'm an officer. At that time, women in the Army, it was a women's Army Corps, always wore skirts and shirts. So it was kind of a double take. There's a lady, but she's in a guy's uniform, and she's an officer. What do I do? Do I salute or just kind of pretend I didn't see her?
It was there at Fort Bragg where Trudy also began one of her favorite jobs, teaching servicemen returning from the war in Vietnam. But they also had warnings for Trudy about what might be faced ahead.
Once we moved to Fort Bragg, then I got a job teaching servicemen. And each class would be 4 weeks long, and it was fellows who were getting out of the Army and wanted to refresh themselves to take a civil service exam. In fact, that's one teaching job that I really didn't want to give up, was the teaching there of the servicemen, because they were all good fellows, nice guys, here and there kind of a cocky fellow but most of them had been to Vietnam. Well, when I was teaching this class, the guys in my class would always say, oh, your husband's going to go to Vietnam, and I must have been in denial because I would say, no, not him, no. But then one day, it was in November, Dave came home and he said, well, I got my orders. What do you mean you got your orders? He said, right here, Vietnam. Again, it was like his draft notice. Shock, like, this can't be. I think that whole next day I just laid in bed and cried because I thought I just want to go to sleep for the whole year that he's gone. But I realized that's not going to happen. So we moved back to Holland, and we were able to rent what was my parents' former cottage, and it was only, again, a couple blocks from Dave's family. Once we moved to Holland, then Dave had a 30-day leave. And I guess I kept telling myself, 30 days, that's such a long time. And then the neighbor lady would ask me once, well, when is your husband leaving? 3 more days. So I made it sound to myself psychologically like 3 days yet, that's such a long time. Well, the day Dave left for Vietnam happened to be Valentine's Day. And the flight wasn't until probably late afternoon. So he took him in, and Dave had said he didn't want his family there or my family there. He said, it's hard enough leaving. I don't need a great big group of people. It was just myself, and I remember walking up in the Grand Rapids airport, you go up this ramp, and you're kind of sitting around on chairs, waiting for the door to open and the call to board. And looking back now, I'm thinking, how awful to sit there and say goodbye to your husband, knowing that you may never see him again alive. So just the emotions of trying to say goodbye and not breaking down, because I want to keep things sort of upbeat and not get each other all worked up, but it was hard. I could have completely lost it there, but I didn't. And I remember just watching his back as he walked into the door. And then that night, my parents thought, well, they didn't want me just going back to my little house alone, so why doesn't my sister and I go out for dinner at the Warm Friend Hotel here in Holland? So we had dinner there, and all this time I'm just sitting there thinking, I just want to go home. But I was too polite to say, no, I don't want to go out for dinner with my sister. I just want to go home. But then when I did get home, I was thinking, how do you go to bed? How do you sleep knowing that Dave's still flying over to Vietnam? I may never see him again. I at least had the cat and our German Shepherd dog. She and I just spent that whole next year together.
Now that Dave was in Vietnam, Dave and Trudy found ways to communicate with each other outside of letters, and those forms of communication themselves would come to play years later.
Our communication between each other first started out with just letters, and then probably after Dave got to his camp, he realized that some of the guys had tape recorders, and hey, let's do this. And I remember the first tape said, well, this is my first attempt at making a tape, and then describing the camp that he's in. It was better than just reading a letter, because I could actually hear his voice, and he would chuckle at something or vent his frustrations, and I could just picture him. And he said the same thing of the tapes I sent his way, because he said, I like hearing all just the little details of you cutting the grass, and the grass sticking on your shoes and tracking through the house, and the sound of the cat meowing to go out. So it was good for him too, and so I tried to keep them upbeat. I pretty much knew a lot what he was doing. I wouldn't know it until a week later because of the time lapse, sending tapes back and forth. But he pretty much kept me informed, unless there were really undesirable things that happened to him. It might just be, well, we had a little shootout at camp, or just to spare me from really worrying about him. Because on one of the tapes he says, I know you don't want me to tell you about a real bad operation that I was on, but it just kind of worked into the conversation, and here's what went down, which wasn't good. I would always make tapes, daily almost. I would spend a lot of time at the beach with our dog, just hiking up in the dunes, because those were the things that we always liked to do together. And waited for the mail truck, because I learned to hear when the mail truck was coming blocks away already. And most days there would be mail, a letter or a tape or something from Dave. On days there weren't, it was, well, maybe tomorrow. Tomorrow's another day. I tried not to think too much about what was going on during the day, but at night, that's when it was harder, because I would think, well, it's daytime now in Vietnam. What's he doing? What's going on? And when I would get a tape, I would think, well, on this date, he was still okay because he made this tape, but it was 4 or 5 days ago. What's transpired between then and now? Is he still okay? I would say Dave's family was very supportive. They would invite me over regularly every evening for dinner. Dave's mother and I would go shopping together. It was somebody that if I needed something, I could call on them, I could depend on them. My parents were in Grand Rapids, and they would come out occasionally to their cottage, which was next door. But I can't say they were really supportive. One time I had read in the Army Times that a fellow OCS officer was killed, and I knew his wife and the little girl, and I was quite upset about it. And my mother, all she said was, "Oh, you didn't go to church today?" And I said, "No, Mom, I was kind of upset. Lieutenant was killed." "Oh, well, that's too bad." The minister would pray for the soldiers in Vietnam, and everybody would pray along with them. But the minute they walk out the church door, Vietnam was not on their mind. "Oh, yeah, well, that's something that's going on over there. Meanwhile, let's get on to our Sunday dinner." So, yeah, it just didn't touch people's lives.
One form of relief from waiting and the physical disconnect from Dave was Dave's week-long leave to Hong Kong that they had been talking about for some time, counting down the days.
Well, I know the first time Dave said, "Well, let's meet in Hong Kong in August. I get a week's leave." I thought, Hong Kong? I've never been there. The furthest I've been from home is Fort Benning, Georgia. I guess that's how you get through it. Yeah. Only because on Dave's tapes, just think, only 300 more days.
Though Dave and Trudy got to enjoy some of the sights of Hong Kong, it was still time to say goodbye. And though goodbye was just as painful, they still had a lot to look forward to. Trudy ended up going on a world's tour, stopping at locations in India, Iran, and parts of Europe. Trudy was also less uneasy. Dave was now working at the TOC, or Tactical Operations Center, a headquarters for all Special Forces activity in his area of operation.
I would say he maybe wasn't quite as frustrated with the personnel that he had to deal with. He didn't so much have to deal with the indigenous people. It was more Americans. But yet it was very discouraging calling in air support for the troops that were out there. Just going over the statistics of American killed as opposed to Vietnamese KIAs was a very big difference in the amount of numbers. So it was discouraging. It was easier after I got home, because I knew that he was out of the danger zone and that there were only 4 more months to go. So I would say it was easier, especially going to bed at night. I didn't have to think, well, what's he doing today? What engagement is he involved in today?
With Dave's tour of duty finally over, he headed home. In a slightly humorous twist of events, Trudy was given the wrong information regarding Dave's arrival and was not there to greet him.
But I thought, well, it can't be his, because they told me 9:30. So I'm dinking around, putting my coat on at the back of the car there and everything, and all of a sudden here this soldier guy comes walking across the parking lot. And I looked, and I thought, that's Dave. Can't be. He's not due for another half hour yet. Yeah. So, but when he got off the plane, he was anticipating me being there. And looks around, well, okay, she's not here, maybe by the luggage. And that's, of course, when he saw me standing by the car putting my coat on. We both laughed like, sorry I wasn't here after you come home after a year. Oh, yeah. And in my mind, I pictured just how it was going to be, that I'd be up there in the little waiting room when he comes off the airplane. And
with Dave finally home, he slept a lot. But then after just a few weeks, Dave went right back to being a student, and Trudy joined him, working at MSU libraries. Life was back to normal.
Okay, great. My husband's home, but all he's doing is sleeping, and I'd peek in the bedroom there, and he'd still be sound asleep. We went right down to East Lansing to find an apartment because school term was starting in 2 weeks. Yeah, and I often think of that too. I think 3 weeks ago, you're in the middle of a war zone, and here you are, civilian clothes, still kind of a short haircut, But I drove him to class, or to MSU for the first day of class, and I felt like I was sending a little boy off to school with his briefcase, because, bye, see you later, and there he is going off to school again. And then shortly after that, I got my job at the MSU library. We didn't have to reintroduce ourselves to each other or anything. Just went back to being normal married people again. And I think maybe part of it is Dave is so balanced. It's not like he's carrying bad stuff back from Vietnam. I mean, he's just that was our job. We did it. It's done. Move on. When we moved to East Lansing, there was a lot of turmoil, protesters and things against the war. It really didn't affect us at all. I did my job, Dave did his job of being a student, and that was it.
With the war behind them and their military lives over, Dave and Trudy returned to being a normal married couple. Though, 30 years later, many of the memories resurfaced of Vietnam for Trudy, who started editing the audio tapes sent between her and Dave during the course of Vietnam. Here is what she said about them.
Well, it's kind of interesting. For probably 30 years, neither of us really dealt with Vietnam memories. It was just something that happened. We got busy with life, with kids, with work. But after probably 30 years, those memories kind of come back up again. And I know that's typical of World War II veterans too. So after 30 years, and then when I was going through the editing of them, listening to the tapes, which I really hadn't heard for 30 years. So listening to the tapes and going over the transcript, it all just came back, just in ocean waves, all these emotions of Dave being gone, and all those emotions which I thought that just weren't there, were still there. I mean, there, and obviously you can hear it now. They're still there. When you read the transcription, yes, it can be gripping and interesting, but when you hear the tapes, that's when you can feel the frustration in Dave's voice, or the loneliness and how he misses the family. It's different when you hear it than when you're just reading it. So when I was listening to those tapes, Dave would come home for dinner and it wouldn't be ready. And I would say, well, I can't leave you right in the middle of this battle. I have to finish this segment of the tapes first. So Chinese takeout that night. So the tapes were for me, extremely emotional to listen to. That's when it just hit me. We have to go back. I have to just relive this all again. And then Dave said, sure, that's great. We can go back to Hong Kong. And then I dropped my bomb. Well, as long as we're going to Hong Kong, I want to go to Vietnam. And he didn't just say no. He said, hell no. But anyway, I won that battle. Because then after a while, he realized, well, it would be good. I wanted to see the places where he'd been. It came not so much out of a love for Vietnam, but I wanted to see where he had been, to feel, to actually experience some of the sights that he had seen. So it was because of my love for Dave that I wanted to see what he'd been through. It was very interesting going back to Vietnam. Just the smells, the heat, the humidity, I could actually experience it rather than just hear about it. So to me, it was just, I can't say it was a fun trip. It wasn't a restful vacation, but I would actually like to go back again. I don't know if it was necessary, but it was something I really wanted to do after listening to the tapes. It wasn't necessary in that I needed closure or any of those buzzwords, but it was time to do it. Yeah. Probably the highlight of the trip was getting to the actual place where Dave's camp was, to see where that side road came in, and to see, it was just a great big field where the camp used to be. We didn't walk back into the field because Dave knew how heavily mined that whole area was, and we didn't want to be a Vietnam War casualty 50 years later, so we just viewed it from the road there. But that was probably the highlight. That and going up to Nui Ba Den Mountain, which is just outside of Tay Ninh there. I think what was more interesting, or just as interesting, was getting as far up Nieuwe Baden as we could, because from that vantage point, we could look over the entire countryside. And there were areas where they were burning rice hull, so it's big plumes of smoke. And I mentioned to Dave, I said, looking out over that, it almost looks like artillery firing over there. And in the rocks on one of the walkways were still bullet holes. I felt closer to the war there than just standing on the road by Dave's, where his camp was, because it was just basically a cassava field. He would talk so often about the flights to and from that mountain, so I thought, well, this is what he actually saw when the helicopters would be taking off, was this countryside.
It has been almost 50 years since the Fetters began their military lives and Trudy became an Army wife. Trudy said it was the separation, not the Army life itself, that was the hardest part. A part that, 30 years later, came back. Though Vietnam does not affect their lives on a daily basis, it compelled Trudy to complete the audio transcription sent between her and Dave during the war, which she finished this past winter. They, along with the videos used in this documentary, are available at the Holland Joint Archives, located on the campus of Hope College in Holland, Michigan. For Trudy, clearly, the memories themselves are something always worth preserving.